all so much for coming to the keynote presentation for the opening symposium of Where the Future Came From. My name is Meg Duguid. I'm the Director of Exhibitions for Columbia College's Department of Exhibition, Performing, and Student Spaces. And now I have some remarks that I'm going to do the unsexy thing and read, so I make sure to get it all in. Where the Future Came From focuses on the role of feminist artist-run activities in Chicago from the late 19th century to present. Today officially kicks off an open participatory research lab intended to create a record around the vast array of feminist artist-run events, programs, and projects that have been organized throughout Chicago's history. We have an action-packed day tomorrow as well. I hope you guys all got programs and agendas in purple. Tomorrow will be artists talking about projects that they have participated in. Throughout the exhibition, there will be 6 scholars in residence who will present about various aspects of the show as well as some workshops. Please come back often. In the gallery, you are going to find a lot of text. I know many of you have been in there already. We are attempting to make an accurate picture of the feminist artist-run activity in Chicago. This work is incomplete and messy. The way people band together is messy, art history is messy, and how this work is archived or not is messy. So the information in the show is intended to be read through, interrogated by scholars in residence, students, artists, historians, and people like you. Please make notes and add to our ever-growing set of information. During the entire run of the show, we will be adding to the show. If you come back multiple times, you will see that we will add in red, because that's how you edit, on the walls. We might add whole new entries. We might edit where we have things wrong. And certainly in the binders that have many, many events in them, we will be adding more information as it's collected. If you have any information of any spaces, projects that might fit in, bring it by, we will add it. Okay, so before we get to the conversation, I want to acknowledge the Terra Foundation and the Art and Design Initiative that funded this program, along with a very long set of staff and student workers who work with us. Emily Gallagher and Rana Liu were our main student research assistants. Gianella Gone, Ashley King, and Lauren Van Rankin designed much of the material in the exhibition, along with our logo. Nisa Page Lieberman, Executive Director of DEPS, has given us a lot of expert guidance. Melissa Potter, who is faculty here at the college, also has provided a lot of support. And Mark Porter, our exhibition manager, along with our student team, installed the exhibition. Lastly, although he's not here tonight, I can't not thank him. Michael Thomas, my partner, who assisted immeasurably, including with conversations about the material in the show, and conversations about this conversation, and with extra childcare. Tonight, we're gonna kick off the keynote. We're gonna kick off this conversation between Lynne Warren and Courtney Fink. There are some goals that we have here tonight. We want to propose that the artist run is the progenitor of new forms and genres that eventually become codified by institution. We want to propose that women have been at the forefront of the artist run, so women organizing have changed the very way we consume art. We will acknowledge that this history that we've gathered is limited both by the way that work is archived and the general lack of inclusiveness in the art world, that is the art world with a capital A. We will think about what a fully inclusive art institution might look like. And we may come up with some new language or terms around the idea of feminist artist run, or at least express that we need it. All right, so now I'm gonna bring up Courtney and Lynne, and I'm gonna read a little bit about them while they are coming up. Courtney Fink is an arts organizer and a curator based in Los Angeles. She is the executive director and co-founder of Common Field, a national network of experimental visual arts organizations. From 2002 to 2015, she was the executive director of Southern Exposure in San Francisco and she serves on the board of directors of the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts and has held positions at California College of the Arts and Cap Street Project in San Francisco, as well as Franklin Furnace in New York. For nearly 25 years, Courtney has been dedicated to developing the capacity of artists and the systems that support them. And then we also have Lynne on the stage. After over 35 years as a curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art, she is currently serving as Adjunct Curator. During those years, she focused on Chicago. She has organized a number of exhibitions, including over 40 solo exhibitions, as well as major exhibitions such as Alexander Calder Forum Balance and the Art in Chicago 1945 to 1995 exhibition, which produced the first comprehensive book of Chicago's unique art history. Her publications include over 30 exhibition catalogs published by the MCA and such publishers as Harry and Abrams and Thames and Hudson, including Alternative Spaces, A History in Chicago, which was also an exhibition. And that exhibition, I will personally be forever grateful for. She has taught courses at the University of Chicago and the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, Northwestern University, and the University of Illinois at Chicago, and has lectured throughout the United States. Welcome. I think everyone has to turn them, yeah.
Okay, hello. Thanks. Thank you.
So we're gonna start with the simplest question I can kind of think of, which is, how and why do artists collectivize?
I'm sorry?
How and why do artists collectivize?
Shall I jump into that?
Please.
Yeah. It's been my experience that in Chicago, anyway, Chicago have organized and collectivized to exhibit because they had no other choice. It's a story I'm sure that happens many other places. But in Chicago, as such a Midwestern art center, which would draw students from all over to the many art schools, you had a population of artists that was much larger than the infrastructure at most times was able to I don't want to say digest, but maybe handle. And also students coming together from all over and becoming acquainted with one another and new ideas from people outside their usual pathways, I think sparked a lot of discussion about art, what it should be, arguments about how one should show, where one should show, if one should show. I know some of those. And I think that the schools here are really a big instigator of getting people together who then come up with ideas to do things, sometimes because they really just want to, but most often out of necessity. And that goes all the way back to the early part of the 20th century.
Yeah, I guess my answer would be similar. I'm not as knowledgeable about the history of Chicago, but my view is from the West Coast and national. And I believe that actually it's really hard to get things done on your own. It's out of necessity also that making these projects is usually a lot more work than people realize. And people usually learn by trying out, as some of you probably have learned for yourself. I also think creating a community of people who have similar desire to kind of make spaces on their own terms and to build frameworks that support things that are not getting supported in the mainstream art world requires a group of people who can work together to make that happen. So I think that history is really, really much longer even than the 19th century, and it's really interesting to me actually to think back past the 60s, which is I think when artist-run collective impulse really gets, it claims that is the start of that movement, and I I'm really excited to kind of think much further back than that about how artists and people have always organized collectively to make these projects happen, usually in reaction to something that they were not included in, or they were erased from, or that they were not invited to be a part of. And so I think that's why people are doing that together.
Yeah, and I actually am so happy, thank you, Meg, for doing all the research that you've done. And I was just reading the essay by Wendy Greenhouse in the new Art in Chicago book that the Terra Initiative put out, which is from the beginning of Chicago as a trading post to, I think it goes up to 1920 or something. And I always knew about these women's clubs, these civic clubs, and you've ferreted out some of those. But I didn't really realize how absolutely important they were for institution building of all sorts. And many of the institutions that we see now, like the Art Institute, or even some of the service clubs like Union League and so forth, there was a huge female influence on the founding of those places and the collecting of art in those places, because most of these women's groups were actually what they call civic groups. They weren't put together to necessarily show art, but they were put together to do social good. And social good was considered, art was considered a social good in the early part of the 20th century for assimilating immigrants and for uplifting people out of, the morass of the slaughter yards and slaughterhouses, and really giving people a refined place to experience an aesthetic world as opposed to their everyday world of labor. And so many institutions, I think, we perceive them as being these bulwarks of, like the male barons, economic barons of Chicago, like Marshall Field or Potter Palmer, all those people. But almost every one of those institutions had really powerful women, like Mrs. Potter Palmer. And it's also very interesting to think that, so many museums were actually founded by women. In New York especially, the Whitney and the Guggenheim. But the role of women, I just think, hasn't been studied very well in this regard. And that's why, again, I thank you for tackling this. It's a huge project.
Well, and so I'm gonna tie back to this idea about schools, because in the show, the very first entry is for the Palette Club of Chicago, and that was a group of Art Institute women who banded together in 1880.
And because the Palette and Chisel Club was all male, and they wouldn't let these women in, and they had to do their own thing, so.
Right, because these women weren't allowed to, draw from nude models. But they exhibited in the very first year the Art Institute was open, which was many years before the building that we know built. So when we talk about women being there from the beginning, they've been there from the beginning, and I think we can assume that even though the history leaves people out, that women and people of color have been around since the beginning of time, so they've done stuff too. But one of the kind of interesting things that I think this show and kind of the work that both of you have done over the years is that so we see these collectivizations happen over and over again. So, why do we think that women-identified artists and feminine artists collectivize over and over again, and is this an effective strategy?
Should I jump into that?
Sure.
Okay. Well, I know here in Chicago, as you've mentioned, when you look back at the early history, the pre-1945, the pre-World War II era, there were a lot of women artists, and a lot of very successful women artists, and unfortunately, many of their names have been completely forgotten. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, but one is that women weren't taken as seriously as artists. Although, interestingly enough, the enrollment of the School of the Art Institute, once it did get founded, more institutionalized, was largely female, because the arts were sort of a female realm, and most men at that time, it's hard for younger women and men to even understand this, they wouldn't enter a career in the arts because they couldn't support a family. And before the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt, you had to support your family through work. You couldn't, have other means to do it. And therefore, a career in the arts really wasn't going to sustain most men having families, marrying and having families. And it was also, the institutions had a lot of female curators and female employees. The director, however, was almost always male, and almost always a trust fund person, a very wealthy person. So, that economic part of this needs to be looked at more. But also in Chicago in particular, after World War II, when the GI Bill really let a lot of men become artists by, having artistic ambitions and going, well, I can actually go to art school because the government will pay for it. And maybe I can make a living. So Leon Golub and that whole group came through, and the women kind of started getting left behind at that point. And by the 70s, then you had a lot of women who had no options to show, except once a year maybe at the annual Chicago and vicinity shows. So I could go on and on, but I'm going to let Courtney chime in here too.
I have like a radical proposition that I believe that a huge majority of the artist-centered history is actually female-run. Even if they're not feminist-leaning or sort of feminist in mission, I really, my experience has led me to see that a huge majority of projects that have existed, that exist around the country right now, are primarily run by women or female identifying people. And I think that's not always what gets remembered or who takes credit, but I actually think that it's really typical that I think like the passion work, the work that needs to get done, that doesn't often get acknowledged, you don't get paid, it's sort of a labor of love, it needs to exist. Women are more willing to create those spaces of care and generosity in general. I mean, I know that's a kind of gross generalization. And then, yeah, the big institutions, the biggest institutions are run by men. And I've lived in several places throughout the country, and this was all, especially in San Francisco, which Meg and I were talking that I think San Francisco and Chicago have a lot of similarities in terms of how the art community works and what a thriving artist-run space world exists there, and big museums. All the spaces were always run by women, and the few big museums were run by men, and that's still the case now. And I think part of why things keep getting reinvented over and over and over again is these things are not viable, right? They are not they're very precarious, they're not economically stable, they require a huge amount of labor, people burn out, these things don't last forever. But I think actually, I believe that is what makes them interesting. They exist in a moment of time for a reason to fill a need, and then they can go away, and then something else can come. And I don't believe that sustainability is actually a value that defines this field at all. That I think, these projects exist for a reason, and they don't need to last forever. And I think that is a real institutional mindset to think that is the case. So yeah, I also think that this need does not go away, right? This need only gets greater and greater, in my opinion. Obviously, it wasn't around in the 1800s and 1900s, but I see right now what's happening to artists, and there's not enough support. And we all, I think, are more willing to recognize the oppression that exists in these large institutions, and the systemic oppression that is not being overcome. And more than ever, the spaces that artists make are filling a lot of needs beyond serving artists, actually. They are really important spaces of debate and dialogue, and where people can come together and take risks. And I believe that there's a real expansion right now of that work, because it's so critical, it's so important, and it's not happening in a lot of other places. Common Field, which is the organization I co-founded with actually some people from Chicago who were part of Three Walls when Three Walls had a different leadership, was founded with the idea that we wanted to connect all of the artist-centered organizations in the country together. And 5 years later, we have about 600 of them, actually, who have built this huge network around the country. And it's just growing and growing at a pace that is hard to keep up with, and it's wildly in flux. Things come and go. It's almost impossible to map. But I'm really excited to discover some new Chicago organizations that are not connected to Common Field, and I hope Common Field can amplify some of the great work that's being done here.
Yeah, I would like to say I don't think it is so radical to think that so many of these institutions, if not, aside from those we actually know were founded by women, that most of them were sustained by women and the labor of women, often the unpaid labor of women or the very underpaid labor of women, which I can personally attest to. But I think there's a real difference between what happened before the internet and what has happened after the internet. And I certainly know when I was doing the research for the Alternative Spaces show, as well as the Art in Chicago project, I was really shocked how generational the knowledge was. Even people who taught, like Ellen Lanyon, who was such a organizer and networker and so important to the women's movement here in Chicago, the knowledge that she was one of the co-founders of Exhibition Momentum and what Exhibition Momentum even was, which was a group founded because they felt completely excluded, mostly from the Art Institute of Chicago, which was about the only game in town in 1945, 46, 47. That all the things that they had learned through founding that group, which didn't have a space, but went around and found what you would call today pop-up galleries, found spaces to do exhibitions, mostly unjuried, non-juried exhibitions, because the Art Institute always had eminent jurors coming from mostly New York and mostly men. And everything that she had done and figured out and how to organize these things and have a structure of, a treasurer and a recording secretary and all those things was just completely lost by the time the alternative space people came along in the late 60s, early 70s to found their spaces. And they really did have to reinvent the wheel because the knowledge just wasn't there. But now, like with what you're doing, the networks of knowledge can be really out there for people to access, and that's a great thing. And so then we have Meg going back and reconstructing some of this knowledge, which is also a very great thing.
Yeah, I just want to add one more thing. I was telling Meg earlier that the first time I ever came to Chicago was in the late 90s, like 97, for a NAO conference, National Association of Artists Organizations. And right around that time, a bunch of the spaces here were going through a lot of turmoil, including like Randolph Street and other places about to close. So that was really what everyone was talking about that year. And then, that was happening in San Francisco too. A ton of the spaces were closing, and it was interesting to get a feel for what was happening then, and also to think in the early 2000s, there was a whole nother national wave of spaces that started. And it really connects to your point where there is this real amnesia that happens where people, and I think it's because the history of this field is invisible. And it is not recorded, it is not documented, it is not widely known or seen. And I could go on about this all day because it's what I think about every day. There isn't sort of a critical value of that work or an understanding of that work. It's very expansive. It's often very diverse in form. It doesn't easily hold together. But it's interesting to think about my first moment coming here and seeing what was happening, and then seeing some of these spaces historicized. But then, are those histories widely known? Are they well archived and documented? I don't think they are, actually, at all.
No, I can attest that they're not. I was actually on the board of Randolph Street Gallery, not at the time it closed down, but trying to keep the records at all was a huge task, and I know many of them did go to School of the Art Institute, but I still have some at my house, so you know, maybe I'll bring some of them in for you. But you know, one of the things I really detest is anachronistic thinking. Do we all know what that means? That means taking how we think today and what we value today and imposing it on the past. And I think there needs to be an attempt to unearth the history for what it was, not what we want it to be because we see through a certain lens today of, you know, inclusiveness, and I want to talk a little bit more about that later, or diversity, these terms that the meaning of these terms really does change, certainly between now and, let's say, the 1950s, which when Exhibition Momentum was writing their manifestos, they talked about diversity and inclusivity. They meant something very different than what we mean today. So I think it's, you know, that's why I brought up the economic part of it. This didn't happen just because artists were, quote, excluded from the institutions. There's a huge morass of dynamic things that went on, and when I talk to people about the alternative spaces of the 1970s, the ones founded in Chicago, and tell them, well, the reason why they got going and lasted as long as they did is because the NEA gave them a whole bunch of grant money. And there was this other program called CETA, which was a make work program that came out during, it was in the mid-1970s, so who would have been president then? It was definitely, you know, like to get gainful employment for people who may not be able to do that. I'm sorry? It might have been Carter. Yeah, the CETA program, CETA it was called. And a lot of these galleries actually were able to hire gallery sitters and people through that program. So there were these federal government programs funding these local things, and then they could also tap into the Illinois Arts Council, which used to actually give out money in a greater degree than it does today. So, you know, it wasn't just, oh, artists banding together. It was artists getting, you know, government grants in a way that is really hard to do today because of how politicized everything has been. But, you know, that needs to be thought through as well of, you know, how these things started, why they ended, and one of the reasons why many of them ended is because they couldn't get government grants anymore. So it's very, very complicated is basically what I'm trying to say.
Well, and I'm going to piggyback on that with two things, because the 70s, if you would believe it, the NEA was expanded under Nixon and grew like tenfold until Reagan's first term in office. Fun fact. But that kind of funding was also true of social service organizations. So you will see projects like the video project at the YWCA. That project was solely started, it's also on the wall in there. That project was solely started because they wrote a grant application to videotape like rape advocates so people could learn how to accompany women to rape trials. And so that started off like a whole project where you could also then teach the women of the YWCA how to use videos and make videos. And there's a video artist, Eleanor Boyer, who made quite a few videos while she was there under the way kind of that social service organization was able to get money. So that funding of the 70s was actually kind of expansive in different ways, and there's always arts kind of happening in these social service organizations because women are so often reclaiming their humanity while making art. And I guess that's just a little aside. But I also, I guess, I want to talk about then, you know, we've kind of we've kind of touched base on this idea that this kind of wheel keeps spinning. but like the narrative stays the same, right? So how do we create new narratives to better address the actual narrative of women's roles in the artist run? And how do we ensure that the work of women and women of color is not left out of institutional narratives?
I can. Well, the narrative stays the same to some degree, but I also really feel like I'd like to actually backtrack a little bit on what you talk about, these social service agencies, because we have such a great history of that here in Chicago with like the Hull House. And I know for years I heard about the theater program at the Hull House because of David Mamet, who's a famous graduate of that, and the crafts program because, tile makers studied there, or the pottery that they did. I didn't hear much about the arts part of it because that tended to be really for assimilating immigrants, and it was really coming more out of a social service idea than a fine arts idea. And to me, the narrative is always been, and still is to a frightening extent, and I saw Camille Paglia talk the other night, and she said what used to be called high art and what used to be called low art. So the fine arts and then arts that come out of maybe social service or other impulses. And to me, that's the real problem, is this bifurcation between what true art is, or, people don't use like good art and bad art anymore, but there is definitely a definition in the contemporary art world of what is, let's use this word, suitable art to show in certain institutions. And it often doesn't fit what a lot of artists are doing, women, people of color, but a lot of other artists are doing work that would never get shown at some of these institutions. So the narrative is, to me, more about understanding how to negotiate these terms, fine art, and the rest of it, or global contemporary art, and really deconstructing them and valuing the art made by people who don't get to show in Art Basel and my own institution, the MCA, or the Art Institute, and the Whitney, and all those, and having people understand how to look at art in venues that aren't obviously art venues. And artists know how to do that, and people involved in the art world sort of know how to do that. But a lot of, people out there, potential audiences, don't necessarily know that. They'll go to the Art Institute, but they're not going to go to, some apartment gallery somewhere. So I think that is a failure of the art world right now, that the definitions are sort of unspoken because it's not politically correct to talk this way. But there is a huge gulf between this sort of sanctified global contemporary art and what is really happening in a lot of artist communities, in artist studios, and artist co-ops, and alternative spaces.
Yeah, I guess this is something I think about a lot because I'm trying to grapple with why this field is so misunderstood and in the shadows. And, what is not known cannot be understood, is kind of how I think of it, because I think a lot of these histories are not recorded. And a lot of them, like we at Common Field realize, like a lot of our stories are oral histories or stories that have been passed down, from intergenerational conversations. And the media does not always cover them, so they do not become recorded in, libraries and archives. There isn't resources to take care of those documents or those histories. While there's some great publications out there and articles about these things, there really isn't a definitive amount. Like even in art history, when you go into academia, my understanding from working with actually some scholars here is it's really frowned upon to focus on this field in your research in PhD study. It has not been approached widely by a lot of people. I mean, some, and but even like Art Journal put out an issue with CAA about the field, and it took years, actually. Common Field in our earlier years were involved in helping to do some interviews and stories for that, and there was so much pushback about that being like considered scholarly material, academic material. So I think that on a lot of levels, the narrative doesn't exist in a lot of ways. It exists in ways that are slightly hidden, maybe not considered mainstream, and also, these are really small projects. If you look at it as a whole, which is what I'm doing now, it makes so much more sense. You really see that 90% of what gets done in the art community happens at this level. That is actually something we all think at Common Field, that the majority of what is really being done is happening in this artist-centered world. It's huge, it's expansive. The institutions do not make up the majority of the art community. So it's like, if we could just flip everyone's understanding of the dominant art world is actually this one and not the institutional one, I think it would make so much more sense to people.
Yeah, if we could only convince people that money doesn't talk, then we'd really have it. It's so interesting for me looking back at the history of what happened at the MCA, particularly when Mary Jane Jacob was curator there. Guerrilla Girls performed, Disband, which was a woman's collective, performed. Does anyone know that? No. I mean, these things got the normal MCA publicity of the time, and Mary Jane showed Magdalena Apkanovich, who finally, got famous because she got a good New York gallery. So I think the narratives are there to some extent. Are they valued? Are they, cherished in some cases? No, a lot of times they aren't. And then sometimes in the future, something happens where people are like, yeah, women are not being shown in New York or in the big galleries like Gagosian or whatever in the proper percentages, or hardly shown at all. And then Guerrilla Girls gets a lot more publicity, and that's great. I'm not saying anything wrong with that. But that whole, 30-year history that went before is often not known at all. And that should, I can't believe academia doesn't want to study groups like Guerrilla Girls. I'm not in academia myself, so maybe they don't. But I do think a lot of it is sort of, I hate to be so cynical, but kind of like fad and fashion, that, when something piques the interest of some of the institutional powers, some of them run by women. There's some very powerful women curators out there and writers. Then these things get looked at. But to sort of consume them all along and be conversant with them and support them does really happen at the level more of what you're talking about. Even though some of these things do happen at an institution, those other institutions that we think of as art institutions.
But don't you think that, I could be wrong, but in Chicago, perhaps there's more of a mutually beneficial conversation between the big institutions and the small organizations. Even the fact that a museum would invest its resources in the project you did in the 80s about the alternative spaces, to me, is really singular and uncommon, and that wouldn't happen at a lot of museums around the country.
Well, that's because Mary Jane Jacob was the chief curator then.
And so
we can thank her for a great deal of my career, actually.
I see usually when it gets adopted by the larger institutions, it's fairly destructive and not in conversation at all. It's like appropriated, but not in recognition of the people who are behind it. And so I don't know how much value that brings back to the artists or the people who are actually organizing it. And the cycle of that, as we know, just keeps getting faster and faster. So I think I see people really just wanting to be completely not a part of that anymore at all. And to sort of say, this system does not work. We need to make a new system. We need to operate outside of that framework and recognize why that system doesn't work. And I think until there's, using the word liberation is problematic, but until there's some sort of like freedom that can happen, I don't know if it's going to be possible. And yeah, it's not valued in our country and certainly in the art community.
Given your work with Common Field, are there any organizations that are nationally kind of doing a good job of trying to like sidestep or kind of undercut the kind of systems that you're talking about?
I think there are. There's so many. It's really hard to know which ones to point to, and I feel like we've barely tapped the surface. And if you really think about it, 600 is not that many. We haven't been to most cities in the US, and it takes, like for instance, we're working in Philadelphia right now. We do a large convening every year, and our next convening is there. So we spent the last year really digging in and doing outreach and connecting to everyone there. And I think we have about 60 groups that are in our network there, but it took a huge amount of work and outreach and like actually asking people to help us to make that happen. We're going to Las Vegas later this month, and again, there's like a whole world that exists there that we know nothing about. So it's hard to really know how truly expansive the field is, versus like who's in our network and then who is just part of this larger, really expansive field. I think that actually there are very few organizations that are widely known on a national level, unless they're really, really long running. Or they are working with a lot of really famous artists, actually. I mean, I think it's interesting to see, it's not coming from the big cities, I think. Some of the work that's most interesting is coming from places where it's more affordable to operate, where you can buy real estate, where you have lots of space for artists, and you can actually experiment with less, and take more risks with less room for, if you mess up, it's fine. There's no one really, no one cares. You can do whatever you want. So like, I'm interested right now in what's going on in St. Louis, even Milwaukee, having spent some time there recently. There's like anything happening there is just completely done by artists. It's the only system there, really. And I think there's a few mentors there who have taught generations of people how to self-organize and are largely behind that there, which is really interesting for me to learn the history of that. But yeah, I can't really like speak to one or the other. Common Field's website has a pretty good map if you're interested in finding out what's going on where. We have a really good growing data set of members and where they work and what they do, and by state, by size, by age, by budget size, by staff, by all sorts of interests and focus areas. And you can search around for like activist organizations who are not nonprofit in Oregon, and you could find out who's doing that there. Sorry, that didn't really answer your question.
No, but I think we can just smush that question into, what do you think some tactics might be that organizations are taking to help like circumvent and open up these histories and these narratives?
Well, I think a lot of larger institutions, let's call them, are really attempting to open up. I don't know if they're trying to circumvent anything, but they're trying to open up. For instance, at MCA, and I think I just noticed something on the subway, said something about there's a $5 card that teenagers can buy and go to all these different live performances. But the MCA just started allowing anyone under, I think it's under 18 and under, in free at all times. And that is, definitely opening up in a very different way. And it's been fairly successful, I think, of, young people before they're really knowing exactly what they want to do. They can come into a space like that and check it out. But, there's always that conundrum of how you present things and money. I mean, money, you can't ignore money in all this. And I think to just get back to some of the history of Chicago's feminist galleries or women-run initiatives, the money has always been the ultimate limitation in any of this. And I mean, you mentioned burnout. that's part of it, but burnout is because you're working there for free and you can't do, support your family properly or whatever. But, I mean, until we have I think a little bit different system of how art is valued and that art is not monetized the way it is today, I'm not so sure that, things are going to change that much, and that many of these groups that you're talking about, which sound like amazing and wonderful, that you're bringing them all together in this network, how effective they can be is probably somewhat contingent on their budgets and how they can sustain themselves and what they can actually mount at any place. And to me, that's something that a lot of people wail about in the art world is, those artists, mostly men, who make millions of dollars in the auction market and all that. But beside creative capital, I don't know of any organizations that are really trying to tackle this head on. And I know out in California, there tried to be some legislation passed where artists would get a cut of auction proceeds, and that actually didn't work, did it? Yeah. So there's just such huge things, and it's really art world and the rest of the world issues more than, I think, just male and female issues, frankly.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think, a challenge, but one that is worth fighting for and trying to accomplish. My 25 years in this field, it's sometimes really depressing to think about how these systems have not improved, and some of the same questions are just being asked over and over. But I truly believe in we can get a lot more done together than we can on our own. And these organizations are so small, it's hard to kind of have a loud voice. But as a larger field, if it can really be visualized, I've seen how powerful it is when people actually can connect and build and share knowledge together and understand that it's actually they're part of something much bigger than their one project. And I think doing that effectively and being able to just distill down a really clear set of goals of what people would want to try to accomplish as a group. It's really hard to do that. It's really hard to do that even in one city or one town. But, and it's a bit idealistic. I'm not naive that it's idealistic to think that could happen, but just Common Field gathering the field together, 500 people who are doing incredible work, who are very inspired by one another and debating the issues that they're dealing with and the urgent kind of causes that they're trying to explore. It's been really interesting to see that the sub-networks that are forming and the groups that come out of that and the cross-pollination of ideas from region to region or from rural space to urban space. And I believe over time that will have an impact in changing things, even if it's not a huge change. The funding thing is feels a little bit like a lost cause. It's just, it's really something I'm working on every day in my work, is to try to advocate on behalf of this field to a national funding community which is largely absent from supporting this. There's very few funders. And I work partly in philanthropy too, so I understand what the gaps are there. And yeah, there aren't a lot of national funders that are focused on supporting this, if only a couple, really. So that's not great.
I think that, there's a glass ceiling, right? If women are doing most of the work at the bottom and the funding is coming to the top, there is kind of a glass ceiling within the way women are going to be able to sustain their roles, despite the fact that their roles are larger.
Yeah, I think what I see happening is people don't even want to be part of the funding structure system at all. They realize that is not functional. That, I'm shocked at how much the field currently is rejecting the notion of the nonprofit. People hate it. At our last convening, everyone kept saying, it's the nonprofit industrial complex. It just reinforces the hierarchies. And I'm sort of thinking, well, it's not horrible. It's not the worst thing in the world. But I think that people really who want to change something and address what you just said are recognizing that they need to exist far outside of it. And I think 70 to 80% of what I see happening around the country, they're not operating in that system at all. They've rejected that system altogether and just want to operate in a different way. So something new is emerging. In terms of like the feminist angle towards it, I don't know how to differentiate, honestly, between the two. I don't.
I'm under the impression that usually women working as feminists, we have a very specific definition of feminist, by the way, that we have used to include these things, because not everyone identifies as feminist. That wasn't always a word that people even identified with, going back to the kind of dates that we're looking at. So the definition of kind of feminist artists that we've been using is women identified and femme artists who work to amplify other women identified and femme artists' work. So the idea of this kind of collectivization, but that it's really about the amplification of voice rather than the political identity of what we see as feminists today. Not that that is not highly important, but to try to make sure that there is a real kind of inclusive way that we're looking at things.
I think that's a great definition, because certainly many of the earlier spaces in Chicago were not feminist. They were woman-founded or woman-run, but they wouldn't probably have the definition of, feminist at that time. They probably wouldn't have even embraced that. But I think actually through some of the women-founded galleries, when they brought people in, like Judy Chicago, and they started doing consciousness raising, that's a term you don't hear too much anymore today, then they may have become more feminist in nature and worked more in that definition of feminism in the 70s and 80s.
Right, and it just goes back to the fact that if everything that is mainstream is white and male, therefore everything that is organized by non-white, non-male people, they're always going to be outside of the fact. So even women who didn't want to be seen necessarily as feminists, we're seen that way, right? Because they were organizing outside of what would have been considered the mainstream. Even if one is creating then or putting out what would not be seen as political or some form of activist art, it is inherently political based on kind of the way the way the organizing happened. So I'm actually skipping. I had a whole bunch of questions, but I'm skipping to my favorite question because I feel like we've talked so much about the institutional, and that the institutional is limited and limiting in certain ways. And I want to know what a feminist institution would look like. We're just going to throw some spaghetti on the wall. Like, what would it look like? How would it be organized? How would people be credited? Would there be a separation between decorative arts and fine arts? Would it have walls? I'm curious.
Well, I don't really have, any ideas about that per se, but I do want to mention that Marcia Tucker, who actually founded the New Museum, now known as the New Museum of Contemporary Art, when she founded that institution, she was a huge feminist. She did a completely non-hierarchical structure. She was sort of the director and founder, but all the decisions were made in group meetings, and no one had sort of what do you call those flow charts of duties and responsibilities. Everyone did collective agreement. It didn't last very long. Now, I don't know if that would create a feminist space, but Marcia definitely had, a great deal of influence on her thinking was, this sort of feminist ideal. So, but maybe you have better grasp on, I'm sure you have a better grasp on this than me.
Well, I think one way to look at it is to see how the feminist organizations now are operating and what makes them unique and how they are structured, because there's tons of examples, not just here, but nationally. I think that there is, I could be wrong, but I see kind of a return of younger women wanting to create spaces for women. Sort of looking back at, the women's building in LA and San Francisco as sort of historic models and wanting to organize off of them and to kind of recognize that these spaces have been lost. I actually feel like there's a lot of them starting by quite like women in their 20s. In LA, I'll point out one example that I'm excited about. About 4 years ago, a collective of women started a nonprofit called Women's Center for Creative Work. And it's built off the idea that it has a very open definition of what they're trying to do, and it's primarily centered on supporting women in all their creative work, from everything from learning technical skills to providing a space that is safe for them to work, to childcare and programming that is curated by the community of women that are building it up. And it's caught on like wildfire, and it's grown in a huge way in only 4 years. And they recognize that it's a model. So one thing they did that could be a good proposal for you is they wrote how to start a feminist arts organization handbook that they put out that you can download for free online, which we should add to your show. And it's like they're saying what we're doing we don't need to be the only ones doing this. We want to help you do it. And it's really thoughtfully done. It's like they're so good at thinking through their model. There's a lot of, they charted out how they make decisions and organize almost everything that they do, and there's a lot of great essays, and it's free. You can buy a nice book version for some money, but they also just wanted to get it out there. And disclaimer, I wrote a little essay for that when they put it out, but like one page that really had nothing to do with starting a feminist organization. But it's been really inspiring for me to see how open source a lot of these projects are, and how they're not claiming that space is their own, that they want to change the definition. I think also there's such a lot of attention on inclusivity and creating spaces for non-binary and female identifying people. In this organization in particular, they're really focused on that. And so it's nice, I think, to see the boundaries expanding and changing, and people's idea of what feminine is changing too. So yeah, that's one great way, I think, is how do you do it? Really, how do you do it? And then how do you help other people start it? And it's very collective, by the way, like everyone, which is exhausting, I know, but everyone makes choices in a group, and they all kind of have to agree on things before it actually happens. Which I have, sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't.
Do you think the way that institutions are divvied up, like larger institutions like the Met or the Art Institute, are divvied up with like a decorative arts section and a contemporary art section and other ways of kind of dividing the institution, does that lead to a different kind of recognition of the work of women?
Well, it certainly leads to a different recognition of the work of artists who don't fall into any of those categories or aren't interested in being typecast that way, so to speak. But I mean, here we do get back to scholarship and academic pursuits of, more the 19th century or 18th century. And I mean, years ago, when at the MCA, people were going, well, what does contemporary mean? And, there was modern art, and now there's contemporary art, and at some point there probably won't be contemporary art anymore because that'll be a historical movement. And so I was always very brash when I was younger, and hopefully I'm still somewhat brash. I stood up and said, okay, at the turn of the next, the millennium, the next century, we should just close the MCA down and say, okay, that is the historical period, and start a new museum. I don't know what we would call it, but it would be no departments, and the MCA's never really had very many departments to begin with. And it would really, look to what is being made at the moment and not historical. But when you have big historical institutions like the Met, I think I do want to see the armor in a different department handled in a different way than I want to see, other things. And there are also caretaking issues you have to deal with. And so the textile department is going to be somewhere where they can keep the temperature proper and the humidity, even more controlled than other parts of the institution. So there are all these sort of larger problems when you try to go to big historical institutions and think, well, they've got to change to be what we want them to be now. I really go for the model of just keep them as they are and learn from them and learn from how the past and the history was, and start all new institutions, which sounds like what you're really promoting as well. So I think there's a lot to be learned from looking at the way these institutions are divided into different disciplines or whatever, to learn how people used to think and understand how far we've gone and how much further we need to go. That's my words of wisdom for today.
Yeah, I have questions about this moment of dismantling that we're going through and what it means to rewrite history, and we could have an all-day conversation about that. I haven't really worked in a museum context. I have worked in an art school context in a California College of the Arts, and the way the disciplines get divided in how artists study, I think is part of why things get, people learn to fit themselves into these categories, like art, architecture, and design, and then like within the fine arts, 20 different departments and so forth. And I've seen a trend in universities breaking down the department model now to just being no departments and everything is together. And I think if that changes and starts to change more, then the institutions that show that work might eventually change. But from like a feminist point of view, thinking about like historic decorative or fiber or other types of work, I feel like artist-run or artist-centered organizations operates in such a different way. It's hard for me to connect them together. What constitutes feminist art? What constitutes the work being done in these organizations that and if you look at a lot of it, it's probably not actually feminist art. It's being done under the roof of an organization who claims a feminist space or a feminist mission. But actually, I'd like to get away from the idea that art has to be feminist in its subject or in its purpose to be feminist. And also, a lot of boundaries are being broken in these sort of experimental spaces where more risks can be taken. So you might even say it's like the most cutting edge of art being made. It just doesn't always make it to the institutional level. Sometimes it does.
I guess, that gets back to this idea of like overt politic and inherent politic, like in terms of like feminist work can be both, in terms of that having that together. What I am going to do is ask our two folks here tonight to just talk a little bit about what they're curious about in relationship to like kind of feminist and the artist run. I'll just throw out a whole bunch of kind of questions for the end of the night, and then I'm going to offer up kind of the audience to ask some questions too.
Yeah, I would actually, I want to backtrack to one of your original statements about what an inclusive institution would look like, because that's something that certainly at the MCA we've discussed for decades now. And it's something I think about a lot, and I've lectured about these topics. I don't think there can be an inclusive institution, and the reason why is because a very wise writer, Italo Calvino, actually, I think it was in a story, but it's a famous quote of his now, that if one were to make a completely detailed map of the world, it would be as big as the world. And if one were to have a completely inclusive arts institution, it might not be as big as the world, but it would probably cover, you know, at least half of the United States at this point if you were going to put everything in there by everybody. So there's a lot of logistics involved in all of this. And, you know, again, inclusive, who gets to define that? And, you know, maybe communities coming together and coming to a consensus on that might work for, you know, that 5 minutes, and then 5 minutes later something changes. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of verbiage out there about, you know, idealistic thinking of, oh, wouldn't this be great? But at some point, and I know artists who found all sorts of organizations really face this more than I ever had to, of the practicality, the reality, the everyday realization of these things. So to me, having people do what they want to do, and maybe having to found their own institutions do that in, and I think we can these days. I think at some point in the past it wasn't possible to found your own institutions to do whatever you wanted to do for all sorts of reasons. That to me is really the key to inclusivity, because there's always going to be gatekeepers at any particular institution that will say, like, well, we're a feminist gallery, we're only going to show work that is overtly feminist. And would you want to force that place to be inclusive and show everything? No, I don't think so. I think people should be able to have the voices they want to have. And I just think there needs to be a lot more debate about these issues. So I'm sorry if I'm not like answering your question, but I felt that was really important to say.
Can I ask you a question about your question?
Yes.
Are you asking us to ask some questions?
Yeah,
That's what I thought. It's a lot of questions.
I'm curious, which I'm going to re-ask my question for a second, but I just want to kind of clarify one point that that institution with a capital I, as we know it, I believe absolutely needs to be more inclusive in terms of better representing women and people of color, period. And that when in which those institutions, because that's where the money is, aren't inclusive, they're actually putting downward pressure on women and people of color organizing and having the ability to actually work out. So I think I just wanted to kind of, before I go back to asking my other question, just kind of point that out when our organizations and artists run to work a little more on the margins, but still parallel with institution, because it's always in the room, that that when they are identifying or self-identifying the need to be feminist or a safe space for a different kind of group, it's because of the lack of inclusion in other kinds of spaces. So I just want to kind of throw that out there as well.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, but I'm just saying you can't have all of the institutions all being inclusive, because they'd all look alike, and they, you know, it's just, there's a lot of subtleties going on there. But I agree with you that a lot of established institutions need to be more inclusive, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's a real moment of reckoning in our world right now in particular, and I think a lot of people are feeling like they can step up and demand the major institutions are not operating in a way that is inclusive, but inclusive is putting it mildly. I really, and I think it's interesting to see how much they're resisting changing because it means giving up power. And so I think some organizations will change and some will absolutely resist it. And I think eventually they're going to have to change. And I'm talking about big institutions and major museums. Like for instance, if you read the news, the art news this week, the big museums in San Francisco just hired, their director left to go run the Met, and then they just did a swap and hired the guy that left the Met. And, you know, I think, again, it's really symbolic to your question that this person was accused of, you know, inappropriate female relationship with an employee and problematic leadership, et cetera. And those institutions are clinging for dear life to their values, which are so not representative of the public. And it's just happening all over the place, and it's a big mess. And I think people are stepping up much more than they ever would have, even a couple of years ago, in my opinion, to speak out to that and speak some truth to power. It doesn't mean it's going to change quickly, but I think it's in I don't live in San Francisco anymore, but just seeing online how many people were mad, that would not have happened 4 or 5 years ago, actually, in the same way it's happening right now. And I think that they don't know how to be accountable at all. Like, they're clueless. And so I think it's about how do we as a community take care to call these things out? How do institutions respond? We've seen this happening a lot with artworks being censored. So I think that was like a big wave in the last few years, that artists spoke up in reaction to and response to works that were not responsible or were problematic, and institutions had to contend with what it meant to support that type of work. And some institutions dealt with it better than others. And I think it's the same thing for structure and power and leadership and non-inclusive spaces. And it's fascinating. It's just completely fascinating to me. And I want to be a part of the system that changes that other system. But I also sort of feel like I just want to build a new system. So I'm just going to do that instead.
Yeah, I actually completely disagree with you that these institutions are clueless. I don't think they're clueless. I think they are hidebound and have power structures that they can't ignore, or else they'll have to close their doors because it takes so much money to keep them going. Well, that was my idea. Just close them down, close them off, and say this is the past, and we're going to do something new for the future. But what has happened with so many of these institutions is they've all thought that they have to chase after contemporary art. And that's where the problems happen, is that contemporary art doesn't allow a lot of the things that were able to go on in other historical periods. And so the Met, saying, oh no, we have to compete with all the contemporary art museums out there and the contemporary art departments. Yet the rest of the institution, is like thousands of years of our history with this very, very rigid system of scholarship and ingrained behavior, which I'm not excusing any of it. I'm just saying that I think they're not clueless, and I think it's a little naive to think these places are clueless. I think that a lot of artists not having insight into how these things are funded and how many millions of dollars it costs to keep a place like the Palace of Fine Arts open in San Francisco. It's easy to stand on the sidelines and go, oh, you should do this and you should do that. But until they find alternate funding sources, then the wealthy male magnates of our economy, I don't know how much they can change. Because it's probably pretty obvious to everybody that money is kind of where I fall down. That's kind of the underlying evil of all of this for me. So do we ask questions now?
Yeah,
of you?
I would like to know, I just want to know, as we're kind of moving forward and kind of building this archive, I'm just actually curious about what you might be curious in relationship to the feminist artist run. And that is a very broad and open question, and I just thought it would be a good way to wrap up and then let some of these people ask questions too.
If you don't mind, let me go because I'm so very cynical. I've never been to the National Museum of Women Art or whatever it's called,
The art.
in the arts. And I don't ever want to go in there because I tend to, I want to see more diversity when I visit museums. And, you know, half the population is men, even though men do occupy a lot of the power structures and the artists that sell and are the market artists. But it's more than just a flip thing for me. It's like, yeah, I'll go see a show of, you know, like Whack or something like that, because I can learn from a show that focuses on a topic. But when institutions sort of segregate, major institutions, let's call them, sort of segregate whoever, you know, it's something that, it's like the flip side of saying, well, everything is male-dominated. And it's like, okay, well then, if everything is male-dominated, do we want everything to be whatever dominated? I like things balanced, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I always want to see a conversation, and sometimes you don't get the conversation in some of these spaces that are very polemical spaces. So that's just me, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who disagree with my viewpoint, but it's kind of where I've always been, is I want to hear a whole range of voices. And okay, sometimes you have to travel to lots of different places to get that, but if I'm going to travel to those places, I probably don't want them to be like gigantic institutions that only show one, you know, sex. If there were a museum of just men artists, I probably wouldn't go there either. Although there's a lot of them that are de facto just men artists.
I'm going to reframe that, hopefully, just a little bit, because I think a feminist artist-run institution doesn't always only have to show women, and that at this point, maybe a feminist artist-run institution or a feminist institution would look a lot more balanced than our current institutions are. So I guess the question is how do we get there?
Yeah, that would be, that would be fantastic. Yeah.
I have so many questions about this. A few of them are, when will we not need feminist institutions? And why do feminist institutions need to continue to exist now? Are people not feeling included in other spaces? Why isn't there a national archive of feminist institutions? Why hasn't that been done? It'd be really interesting to look at sort of this wave around the country, not just in Chicago, and probably learn that it is huge and much bigger than we realize. Why is feminist art history disconnected from the feminist artist run? And why aren't there more shows where it's just all women and you don't say it's all women, it just is, like, sort of without saying anything about
I agree
it?
with that, yeah.
That's, I had that experience recently, and it was so nice to just not, that wasn't what the show was about. It was all women artists. It wasn't proposed as a feminist show at all. And it was such like a breath of fresh air to not even realize it until after I'd seen the show. Like, oh, that was on purpose in every way. It was so smart and well done. So those are some of the questions I have. I recently went to a conference where I was in this session that used this format. Have any of you used this format? It's called Kaleidoscope. So it's this, we were doing a land acknowledgement with Native American arts organizers about, you know, much larger historic systemic oppression about land use, and if you acknowledge the native land that you're on when you start something. And they use this format called Kaleidoscope, which I'd never used, and it was pretty profound for me. And you only frame your thinking in questions. So after these three people presented their work, the audience, so there's like 100 people, the way you could respond was only in the form of a question. And I actually think there's a lot, sometimes more to be gained by the kinds of questions that people need to ask versus actually things that don't have a lot of good answers. And so I've been thinking a lot about questions, and especially around this, which, you know, not to bring it too much into this, but the Me Too movement, I can't help but think about that movement in light of these types of conversations, and how the art world has been contending with that or not, and how that really, how does that movement in the art community connect to the need to kind of ask the question about female spaces and the need for them. And it's not something that really got discussed tonight so much, but I was recently part of a conversation about Me Too in the art world, and it just, people didn't have the language to talk about it in a clear way yet, I think. But people want to, and it's starting to become something. But I think in the art community, it hasn't been dealt with really in an open way yet. And it probably has a long way to go before it is.
All right, so I'm going to take that moment to now open this up to a kaleidoscope, if I'm doing that right. Melissa Potter, right here, is going to borrow my microphone. Or wait, there's one in the back. There's one in the back for you. Because we're recording tonight, we want anyone's questions to be on the tape. Just for fair use, this is going to be broadcast on CAN TV, available online, and then we are using the transcript or some edited form where all of my ums get edited out in the catalog. So just so you know, we would like to be as inclusive of questions as possible. So go ahead. All right.
We've stunned you all into silence, apparently.
Oh, wait.
Here we go.
Thank you. In regards to the Women's Museum that you mentioned you had some sort of aversion to, I wanted to ask if the principle of if a stick is bent too far in one direction and you kind of need to bend it proportionately the other direction, do you think there is a function to some sort of reverse exclusivity?
I'm sorry, I don't know exactly what you mean by reverse exclusivity.
You said how there is a sort of, you like the inclusivity and how the women's only museum seem to be excluding things and how you like to see a balance. But I assume that overall you do see a function in...
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
as I mentioned, I'm a little cynical. And
Right.
I'm glad that institution exists, and
Right.
I'm sure they do wonderful work. It was really more of a personal statement, but also somewhat of a political statement of, it's kind of a cry and shame that there had to, when was it founded, in the 80s? That there had to be a museum like that founded because women were being neglected by the rest of the institutional art world. I mean, I'm fully cognizant of that. I just think today, it's a bit of an anachronism to have a woman museum, but I understand the importance of it. It's certainly been important to many artist friends of mine in being able to show, and it is very, very important to have your work shown, to have catalogs written about your work, to have the type of audiences that go to major museums look at your work. So it's more that however you're going to structure the art world, today it's probably better to structure it thinking that everything has to be a little bit more open. And I don't know exactly how to do that because there's such competing factors going on. And if you're going to have an art world that is really dominated by the international art market, then boy, then we've got a big task in front of us. I hope that answered your question.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Oh, we had one over here, and then I'll pop right back over here. Thank you. In the late 1970s, which is when I did my undergraduate work, this sounds really funny, but there was a big trend in feminist and identity politics art. And there is, again, now in a different way. And so I have two questions. One is, what is the difference? I mean, our goals might be different. A lot of them feel the same to me. Also, but how does it look? What is the different quality and look to what we're working toward today than what was being really grappled with in the 1970s and 80s in terms of inclusion in the art world, and also in terms of art being created? And then the other thing is just an observation that I'd kind of like to hear your take on. In the time in between, globalism was more of a word that the art world was reckoned by than individual identities. But somehow globalism became white male again, or at least that seemed to be the look. And so I guess the question attached to this is, did we not work hard enough? Like, was there a huge energy that went into individuals' political stories that we almost got a confidence and then realized that it wasn't enough?
Well, if I may, I think there's a dirty little secret about a lot of this, and it also includes, the work of so-called minority artists, is that the art world historically, and even today, has a certain look that they want. And, at any particular decade, it would be different. In the 70s, what Judy Chicago was doing didn't look right to the people in power. It looks great to the people in power now. She's getting shown all over the place. And it's a bit of, I've always talked about this in terms of African-American artists, is that the MCA actually showed a lot of African-American artists kind of all along, including Romare Bearden. And I think one of the reasons why he wasn't shown widely in contemporary art museums is because he was a modernist. He was a modern artist. He wasn't dealing with, conceptual art and land art and all those things of the 70s and 80s that were considered valuable. So I think the style of art has something to do with it, and getting people who think they're art experts to understand there are different modes of art making, and that what doesn't look right to them for whatever reason, they can learn, to appreciate its aesthetics. And we've certainly seen that with the Afro-Cobra movement here in Chicago, which I've always known about, but suddenly seems like everybody's discovering it. And I think that's true with a lot of, women's art, is the way it looks to people is, somehow not something they can understand. Maybe 20 years later they will, and I think that happened in the 70s, that a lot of female artists, they were just considered, it just doesn't look right. It doesn't look like what we would show. And I know that's very kind of stupid and shallow to say, but people have tastes, and curators have certain educations that they rely on in looking at art. And if they look at something and it doesn't look like what they understand and feel familiar with, they might reject it, no matter who it's by. I mean, I know a lot of male realist artists who've got nowhere, because it's a type of realism that the art world doesn't like. So it's just my understanding of it, but.
Yeah, to try to maybe tackle, because there's a lot of questions, maybe one of them, or a couple of them, sort of the return to a certain set of ideas from what you're talking about, late 70s to now. I think it's taken an incredibly different form, from object-based work to socially engaged work. And that's kind of how I see it playing out. So work that's happening outside of an institutional context maybe, or embedded in communities, or place-making kind of work. But if you really think about this idea of why did we revert back? I can't separate the art world from the world. And I think a lot of people thought, oh, we've made progress, right? Look at how things have changed. And now I think people are finally admitting that actually no, things are actually still not so great, and we have a lot of work to do. And so the change hasn't really been done. It's sort of so easy. And look at the state of our world right now, sort of reverting back to, you know, like a more nationalist, fascist tendency. And I think if you think about the art world, I'm not surprised that they're connected. I just can't help but think about it's a reflection of the moment we're in. And the moment we're in now maybe was, I don't know if it was similar to the late 70s in politics. I wasn't old enough at that time, but yeah.
But I also want to add, you know, the current, you know, notion, and you mentioned the global artist. All those artists are educated at a few elite art schools, and they may be from, you know, Egypt or Malaysia or whatever, but they're speaking the language that they learned at art school for the most part. And that's the language that the international art world understands, and you know, they're curated into all sorts of exhibition opportunities. And they may be dealing with, you know, their own culture and their own background, but they're dealing with it in the prescribed way that the current art world thinks, you know, is the right way to speak, I guess, is a better term than to, you know, because a lot of this is not visual so much. It is all these different forms that we see with video and time arts and performance and social justice and all the different topics that we see. But it is a vocabulary that's learned at art schools, and a lot of artists don't do that vocabulary, especially I think a lot of women artists, because they find it, you know, the old power structure that is still almost left over from the salons of the 19th century. You know, the way you're educated as an artist is important, and the way a lot of art schools are educating artists right now is to create these sort of global art stars because of the teachers they have, basically, who are art stars. And I remember, I went to the School of the Art Institute, and I remember the moment that they threw out all the old people that were teaching there for decades, who were very good teachers, and started hiring artists who had exhibition track records, like we're showing currently. And boy, things changed there radically.
Is she on? Am I on? Hello?
Well, I'm not sure if I have a question or I'm just standing. But, you know, when you mentioned Afro-Cobra, and I think about when I became an artist and what motivated me, and I am with a group of women artists as Sapphire and
Sapphire,
Crystals
I was
here-
going to say Sapphire and
here in
Crystals, yeah.
Chicago. But, you know, a dance, I would, like we're dancing around the whole concept that, yes, in America, or what may even be becoming global in terms of the art understanding, we're talking about a white, male, European-centered value decision-making course. And we, in order to move forward, and culture has to move forward, culture has to be current and related to the time it exists in. That's what, to me, makes art important in culture, because it's a response and it's hopefully the best of your lifetime in the moment that we are here. It's going to change for our children and their children, and it can't continue to be white, male-centered globally at all. It has to be more self-determined, and self-determined to make a humanity that we can all get on the same page for. And I think women, feminists or whatever, I think women by nature are nurturers. By nature are teachers and part of that safeguard of the future in some ways, because they can't have it without us. So I don't know if this question, if it's a question or just maybe
I'll let you talk. I just want to say Marva Jolly was such an important person to me. A lot of people have no idea who she is.
Yes, there's so many black and brown and other women.
She really was a
nobody
mentor
knows.
for a lot of
But we have to
African-American
do our
women.
history. I applaud you for doing this project.
Well, and I guess one of the things, I'd like to touch on Nancy Liu's question, and I also just want to mention that so often, I'm going to start one way. So often we talk about feminist organizations from the 70s and 80s, and they are ARC and Artemisia. And so if you guys ever talk about feminist organizations, I'm going to everyone here a task. If you ever talk about feminist organizations from the 70s and 80s, you will say ARC, Artemisia, and Sapphire and Crystals. Because the work that they have done has been, I think, unbelievably important in Chicago and actually unbelievably under-recognized. And the fact that they are not said in, I think, the same breath as those two organizations on a regular basis speaks to a lot of the problems in the art world and the world in general. And I want to just kind of touch to Nancy's question about have we done enough work? No. The answer is no, not enough work was done, because the art world, when I was in school, looked at the Reader. I was in school in 1995, and we looked at the Reader to find all of our art exhibitions. Well, you know, the Reader only got delivered to Roosevelt. Like, it didn't even go to Pilsen. So my education was ungodly lacking. And then here we have the Chicago Defender that has been around on the South Side since 1912, something like that. And the kinds of listings that are in the Defender cover all sorts of goings on in the South Side. The hopping gallery scene in like the 1950s on the South Side is almost unrecognized in spaces that I was educated in. And that is kind of part of the impetus for this show, is there's a lot of stuff missing. I want these walls to be like red in the end, like literally red with edits, because I know that women make artwork, and women have been organizing since the beginning of time, and that we are just missing it. We're missing so much. And especially like women of color are left out 3 times more than white women, and we know that we're missing just tons of activity in Chicago.
Yeah, and one of the issues I think that people don't know about Sapphire and Crystals is there was no space to go to because you float. And certainly the show I did in 1984, alternative spaces, one of the definitions, and if it was being done again, I might have changed the definitions, was there had to be a space that you had. So that model was, whatever it was, and shouldn't be duplicated again today. But the important work of the Terra Foundation Art and Design Initiative, there's a whole segment on Marva in the Black Metropolis of Art segment of the Art and Design in Chicago WTTW show, which tomorrow night is the last, actually covers alternative spaces and the Hubbard Street scene, put a plug for it in. So there's a lot to be learned about what went on in Chicago in general, and certainly on the South Side. And I think we're making little baby steps to learn more about it, and this project certainly will help that a lot.
The whole time you're talking, I was like, yes, exactly. Thank you for saying what you said.
I can't imagine a better note to end a transcript on than exactly that. So we start again tomorrow. Breakfast will be served at 8:30 a.m. and we will start promptly at 9. We have an action-packed day. Tomorrow we will serve breakfast and lunch to attendees, and you will actually hear from, tomorrow we're going to be hearing from artists who have been involved in various organizations, and then we're going to have a big celebration between 4 and 5 o'clock tomorrow, whenever we end up. There are also 6 scholars in residence who are speaking. I'm just repeating myself because I want to make sure everyone knows. 6 scholars in residence who will be speaking at the table in the gallery during the run. They will all be worth it. every one of them, so please come. Come early and come often. You vote that way too. Thank you so very much for coming out tonight, and we will see you all tomorrow.
Thank you all.
Thanks to Meg for organizing all of this.